In the months leading up to the Tet Offensive, few in the American command structure believed that the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong retained the capacity to launch a coordinated nationwide assault. Intelligence reports had hinted at heightened activity, unusual movement along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and an increased boldness in Viet Cong reconnaissance efforts. Yet senior commanders, guided by optimism, political pressure, and the mistaken belief that the enemy had been worn down, dismissed many of these warnings. General William Westmoreland, the U.S. commander in Vietnam, had repeatedly argued that the communist forces were on the brink of collapse, weakened by aggressive American search and destroy operations and a year of heavy fighting in 1967. Press briefings in Saigon confidently projected that the enemy lacked the manpower or supplies for any large-scale offensive. American officials in Washington echoed these claims, hoping to reassure a public increasingly uneasy about the war's progress. The North Vietnamese, however, had been preparing something far more ambitious than most analysts imagined. The plan, developed under the leadership of General Vo Nguyen Giap and the political strategists in Hanoi, aimed to strike simultaneously across the length and breadth of South Vietnam. The timing was to coincide with Tet, the Lunar New Year, a holiday traditionally marked by ceasefires and celebration. The idea behind the offensive was not merely military, it was psychological, political, and symbolic. By attacking at the very moment when peace was expected, the Communists hoped to shock the South Vietnamese government, ignite uprisings in the urban population, fracture American confidence, and force the war into a new phase that favored the North. In late January 1968, as families cleaned their homes, prepared special dishes, and lit incense for ancestors, tens of thousands of communist troops quietly moved into position. Many disguised themselves as peasants, porters, or festive travelers. Weapons were smuggled into cities hidden in funeral coffins, market carts, and crates labeled as holiday goods. Viet Cong agents embedded in Saigon, Hue, and dozens of provincial capitals finalized last-minute coordination, awaiting the signal that would set the country ablaze. The offensive officially began in the early hours of January 30 in the northern regions, earlier than scheduled due to miscommunication. But the full force struck on January 31 when the rest of South Vietnam awoke to an explosion of coordinated attacks unprecedented in the war. Cities that had long been considered safe suddenly echoed with gunfire. Saigon, the heart of the South Vietnamese government and home to American headquarters, came under direct assault. Viet Cong commandos stormed the U.S. Embassy compound, breaching the outer wall and engaging Marines in a fierce firefight that shocked the world when images appeared on television. The embassy, a symbol of American power, had been penetrated, not captured, but attacked with a boldness that erased any illusion of safety. Across the city, the Viet Cong struck police stations, radio stations, military bases, and even the presidential palace area. Although most of the attackers were ultimately defeated, the psychological impact was enormous. That the Viet Cong could strike the capital so deeply, so suddenly, and on such a large scale contradicted the repeated assurances that the enemy was weak. In Hue, the ancient imperial capital, the battle took on an intensity that would become one of the most grueling urban fights in American military history. North Vietnamese regulars and Viet Cong units swarmed into the city, capturing the citadel and much of the surrounding urban districts. As dawn broke over the Perfume River, stunned residents watched communist flags being raised over sections of the old imperial walls. The Allies were caught completely off guard, and the initial response was chaotic. South Vietnamese forces struggled to regroup, while U.S. Marines rushed in under heavy fire, forced to fight block by block, often without clear maps or reliable communication. For nearly a month, Hue became a brutal urban battlefield, filled with destroyed homes, shattered temples, and streets littered with rubble and bodies. American Marines described it as one of the most punishing combat environments they had ever seen, with snipers hidden in every window, booby traps buried under debris, and entrenched North Vietnamese soldiers fiercely defending every inch. Yet the offensive was not limited to major cities. More than 100 towns, bases, and outposts across South Vietnam came under attack. The Viet Cong sought to spark an uprising in the countryside as well, hoping for mass defections from the South Vietnamese army and widespread support from rural populations. In many villages, especially in the Mekong Delta, communist guerrillas launched surprise raids on district headquarters, killing local officials and intimidating communities they believed would side with them once the South collapsed. However, the anticipated uprising never materialized. Many rural residents were terrified rather than inspired, unwilling to risk their lives in unpredictable political upheaval. Meanwhile, ARVN, or Army of the Republic of Vietnam, fought harder and more effectively than expected, countering the narrative that South Vietnamese forces were incapable of holding their own. Their resilience in many areas, especially during the later stages of the offensive, surprised even American advisors. Despite these local successes, the overall shock of the Tet Offensive was undeniable. In the United States, news footage of burning buildings, civilian casualties, and desperate fighting contradicted the official narrative of progress. Journalists who had been cautiously optimistic now questioned whether victory was possible. Walter Cronkite, the most influential news anchor in the country, famously declared that the war seemed to be mired in stalemate, a statement that reportedly led President Lyndon Johnson to remark, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Politically, Tet shattered the administration's credibility. Militarily, the Communists suffered enormous casualties, far more than American and South Vietnamese forces. But strategically, they achieved what they most desired: a collapse of public confidence and a shift in American policy. Tet demonstrated that the war was far from over, far from controlled, and far from winnable under the current strategy. In Hanoi, despite losing thousands of fighters, leaders celebrated the psychological victory. They had proved that no city was safe, no strategy was secure, and no amount of American firepower could prevent a nationwide coordinated assault. For the U.S., Tet forced a painful reassessment of strategy, political commitments, and the belief that overwhelming firepower alone could determine the outcome in a war rooted in ideology, nationalism, and persistence. Although commanders in Vietnam pointed to the devastating losses suffered by communist forces, the American public saw only the scope of the attack and the realization that they had been misled about the enemy's strength. The Tet Offensive did not end the war, but it changed its trajectory forever. As the shockwaves of the initial Tet assaults rippled across South Vietnam, both sides scrambled to understand the scale of what had just unfolded. For American commanders on the ground, the first hours were chaos layered on disbelief. Radio transmissions crackled with contradictory reports, some units describing heavy firefights in provincial capitals where no enemy presence had ever been detected before, others confirming major assaults on bases thought impregnable, and still others reporting complete silence in areas expected to be hotly contested. The sheer unpredictability of the offensive paralyzed decision-making as commanders realized the enemy had planned a synchronized, nationwide attack that challenged every assumption made in previous months. Many American officers, long accustomed to jungle warfare and rural ambushes, were stunned to find themselves embroiled in urban combat across dozens of cities. The Communists had chosen their targets strategically, not limited to symbolic locations, but including logistical hubs, communication centers, government buildings, and even prisons intended to be liberated for new recruits. In some cities, Viet Cong forces targeted radio stations, attempting to broadcast revolutionary messages to encourage uprisings. In Saigon, a team had stormed the national radio station, but quick-thinking South Vietnamese security forces disabled the transmitters before the attackers could broadcast their pre-recorded proclamation. The failure of this particular gambit proved important. Had the message gone out across the country, it might have amplified confusion and fear, possibly inspiring more urban unrest. In other areas, however, the Communists succeeded in capturing local radio or propaganda outlets, if only briefly. One of the most dramatic elements of Tet was the degree to which the enemy was able to infiltrate areas previously considered secure. Allied intelligence had long believed that while the Viet Cong operated throughout much of rural South Vietnam, they had limited presence in larger urban centers. The offensive proved that assumption disastrously false. In truth, Viet Cong networks had spent years quietly embedding themselves in cities, working as vendors, students, monks, bureaucrats, and laborers. They mapped government buildings, identified weak points in security, stored weapons in hidden caches beneath family homes, and communicated with the North through covert operatives. For many civilians, the sudden emergence of guerrilla fighters from seemingly ordinary households was shocking, creating an atmosphere of deep mistrust and suspicion that lingered long after the fighting ended. The initial stages of the offensive also revealed stark contrasts in morale and preparedness among Allied forces. Some South Vietnamese units, caught by surprise and overwhelmed by the ferocity of the attack, faltered or retreated, unable to rally quickly enough to defend their positions. In other areas, however, ARVN units performed with remarkable resilience. In cities like Bien Hoa and Kon Tum, South Vietnamese troops held their ground against determined assaults, buying time for American reinforcements to mobilize. Their performance complicated the common perception, both in the US and elsewhere, that ARVN forces were generally ineffective. American advisors embedded with these units often praised their determination, particularly in the later phases of Tet when counterattacks began. As the fighting continued, a grim pattern emerged. The Viet Cong and NVA had managed to seize territory quickly in the opening hours, but they struggled to hold it. Their hope for widespread popular uprisings failed to materialize, leaving many of their urban units isolated and without reinforcements. American and South Vietnamese forces, regaining their footing after the initial shock, launched aggressive counteroffensives. These counterattacks were often brutal, characterized by close-quarters combat that devastated entire neighborhoods. Artillery and airstrikes were used heavily, sometimes leveling blocks that had already suffered intense small-arms fire and explosions. Civilians caught in the crossfire endured unimaginable hardship, fleeing their homes, hiding in basements, or attempting to escape the cities entirely. Humanitarian crises erupted across South Vietnam, overwhelming medical facilities and relief stations already strained by years of conflict. Nowhere was the suffering more severe than in Hue. The battle for the city, which had begun swiftly and decisively for the Communists, devolved into a prolonged and bitter struggle. North Vietnamese regulars, unlike the more lightly equipped Viet Cong fighters elsewhere, were disciplined, organized, and deeply entrenched. They fortified buildings, transformed ancient stone walls into defensive barriers, and used the narrow streets and tightly packed structures to their advantage. Marines and ARVN forces found themselves battling through a maze of ruined buildings, sniper nests, and booby traps. Progress was measured in meters, not miles, sometimes in inches. The thick masonry of Hue's traditional architecture, beautiful in peacetime, became deadly in war. Standard small-arms fire often proved insufficient to dislodge enemy positions, forcing Marines to rely on recoilless rifles, flamethrowers, and explosive charges to clear fortified rooms and bunkers. Many Marines later described the sheer exhaustion of clearing a single house, only to face another just like it, equally fortified, equally deadly. Casualties mounted on both sides with alarming speed. Yet the battle for Hue was not merely a military confrontation, it had profound political and psychological dimensions. As Communist troops occupied the city, they conducted mass executions of officials, perceived collaborators, and civilians deemed a threat to revolutionary goals. These purges, often carried out methodically, left deep scars on the population and contributed to the eventual unraveling of Communist support in certain regions. The tragedy, combined with the devastation wrought by the prolonged counterattack, made Hue one of the war's most infamous symbols of suffering. While Hue raged on, events in Saigon continued to capture global attention. Although the Communists were unable to hold key positions in the capital, their assault on the U.S. Embassy remained a defining moment. When journalists were allowed into the compound after the attackers had been killed or captured, the images they produced, bodies sprawled in the courtyard, bullet holes in walls, debris scattered across the ground, conveyed a sense of violation and vulnerability. For many Americans watching from home, the sight was deeply unsettling. It challenged the assumption that American power was omnipresent and that progress in the war was steady and assured. Television played an unprecedented role in shaping public perception during Tet. For the first time in history, a war was being broadcast into living rooms in near real time. Images of burning cities, wounded soldiers, grieving civilians, and chaotic firefights made the conflict impossible to ignore or sanitize. The narrative emerging from the battlefield diverged sharply from official government statements, creating a widening gap between public sentiment and political rhetoric. Journalists began to ask sharper questions, pushing back against overly optimistic reports from the Johnson administration and military officials. Some reporters openly challenged the credibility of the official briefings, which came to be derisively known as the 5 o'clock follies. As criticism grew louder, the administration struggled to regain public trust. Within the military, frustration also simmered. Many commanders blamed civilian leadership for unrealistic expectations and contradictory policies. Troops on the ground, who had borne the brunt of the fighting, felt their sacrifices were being minimized or misunderstood. The psychological strain of Tet reverberated through every level of the military, from enlisted soldiers to commanding generals. Meanwhile, in Hanoi, leaders analyzed the unfolding events with cold calculation. They had always expected high casualties. It was a fundamental part of their strategy, rooted in the belief that they could sustain losses far greater than the Americans were politically willing to tolerate. Although some in the North had hoped for greater popular uprisings in the South, they nevertheless considered the offensive a strategic success. The international attention it generated, the political upheaval in Washington, and the shaken confidence of the American public were seen as major victories that would ultimately hasten the end of the war. As February turned into March, the Tet Offensive began to wind down, but the aftershocks had only just begun. The United States found itself grappling with a new reality. Despite military superiority, victory no longer seemed attainable through conventional means. The South Vietnamese government, though still standing, had been exposed as vulnerable, and the North Vietnamese, despite suffering catastrophic casualties, remained determined, resilient, and unwavering. Tet had reshaped the conflict, not through territorial conquest, but through the destruction of illusions. And as policymakers in Washington struggled to respond to this new landscape, Vietnam itself stood battered, grieving, and forever changed. As the smoke of battle began to lift across South Vietnam in the late weeks of February 1968, a grim clarity settled over both the American and South Vietnamese leadership. The immediate shock of Tet had started to fade, but its consequences were only beginning to surface. The once confident assurances of progress issued by the Johnson administration had been shattered, replaced with an uneasy awareness that the war was far more complex, far more entrenched, and far more unwinnable than previously believed. For the first time since large-scale U.S. ground operations began, political doubts outweighed military optimism. President Lyndon Johnson, who had long believed that steady escalation and relentless pressure would eventually push the North Vietnamese to negotiate, now found himself confronted by advisors divided, frustrated, and increasingly pessimistic. Reports from Saigon painted a bleak picture. General Westmoreland continued to insist that the communist offensive had been a military disaster for the North, citing their heavy casualties. But many in Washington questioned whether such tactical victories had any strategic meaning. After all, if a supposedly weekend enemy could coordinate attacks in more than 100 cities, infiltrate the capital, occupy Hue for weeks, and strike at the heart of American power, then what did progress truly mean? Johnson struggled with this contradiction daily. In late February, he met privately with senior advisors, including Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, whose once confident belief in statistical metrics, body counts, kill ratios, attrition rates, had collapsed. McNamara, increasingly disillusioned, confessed that the war could not be won militarily and advised seeking negotiations.
The president, worn down by years of political strain, growing anti-war protests, and endless demands for troops and funding, listened with weary resignation. At the same time, powerful voices within the Pentagon and military establishment insisted that the offensive proved the North was desperate, depleted, and on the verge of collapse, if only the United States committed more troops. Westmoreland requested an additional 206,000 soldiers to launch a major counteroffensive and secure every urban center. This request sparked shockwaves in Washington. After years of escalation, the notion of adding hundreds of thousands more troops felt like stepping into a bottomless pit. The American public was already questioning why previous troop increases had not delivered victory. The Tet Offensive made clear that even 500,000 soldiers were not enough to secure the country. The idea of committing nearly 250,000 more triggered outrage among congressional leaders who feared political collapse. Meanwhile, the anti-war movement in the United States surged to unprecedented levels. College campuses erupted with protests. Demonstrators marched through major cities carrying signs demanding an end to the war. Veterans returned home disillusioned, their stories contradicting official government narratives. The credibility gap, the mistrust between what the government said and what the people believed, became a defining political crisis. News commentators openly questioned the administration's strategy, while previously moderate citizens found themselves wondering whether the war had become a futile quagmire. The White House sensed the shifting political winds. In March, Johnson delivered a televised address in which he announced a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam and expressed his willingness to negotiate. At the end of the speech, in a decision that astonished the nation, he declared he would not seek re-election. It was a moment that symbolized a profound political rupture caused by Tet. A war intended to preserve American prestige instead consumed presidency. While events in Washington spiraled into political upheaval, the military reality on the ground remained brutal. The Allies had regained control of most urban centers, but much of South Vietnam lay in ruins. Cities like Hue were scarred beyond recognition, whole districts flattened by artillery and airstrikes, monuments and temples shattered, thousands of civilians killed or displaced. Refugee camps overflowed as families fled the destruction, seeking safety in already overcrowded areas. Humanitarian organizations struggled to cope with the sudden crisis, distributing food, blankets, and medical supplies to traumatized populations. Disease outbreaks followed in the wake of displacement, compounding the suffering. The South Vietnamese government, eager to reassert its authority, scrambled to rebuild administrative structures disrupted by the offensive. Yet the public's trust had been deeply shaken. Many citizens questioned whether their leaders could protect them, especially after witnessing the ease with which the Viet Cong had infiltrated cities. The purges in Hue, where communist cadres executed government workers, teachers, religious figures, and civilians suspected of allegiance to Saigon, left a lingering sense of fear. This brutality, while intended to weaken the South Vietnamese government, ultimately horrified many who might otherwise have sympathized with the revolutionary cause. In the countryside, the situation was equally complex. The Viet Cong had suffered staggering losses, entire units decimated, networks disrupted, and cadres killed. For months after Tet, many rural areas saw a temporary decline in guerrilla activity, giving American and ARVN forces the illusion of renewed control. Yet this lull was deceptive. The North Vietnamese army quietly moved in to fill the gap left by the Viet Cong, shifting the war from a primarily guerrilla conflict to one increasingly dominated by conventional, well-trained forces from the North. American intelligence recognized this shift, but struggled to adapt. The enemy they had long portrayed as a fading guerrilla force was transforming into a formidable conventional army capable of large-scale operations. Throughout the spring and summer of 1968, despite the heavy losses of Tet, the North Vietnamese regrouped and launched follow-up offensives, less spectacular but still deadly. These many Tet attacks demonstrated that the communist resolve was unbroken. In many ways, the post-Tet landscape revealed the fundamental strategic asymmetry of the conflict. For the North, defeat in battle was tolerable so long as the political struggle continued. For the United States, battlefield victories meant little if public support eroded. Hanoi understood this dynamic well and believed that every American doubt, every protest, every political fracture was equal to a battlefield triumph. International reactions also shaped the aftermath of Tet. Allied countries with troops in Vietnam, Australia, South Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, questioned their roles in the war. Some began planning withdrawals or reduced commitments. The Soviet Union and China, long supporters of North Vietnam, interpreted Tet as evidence of the South's weakness and the Americans' vulnerability, prompting renewed material and diplomatic backing. Diplomatically, negotiations in Paris began, but progress was slow and fraught with disagreements. The North Vietnamese delegation remained firm in its demands, while American negotiators struggled to reconcile military objectives with political realities. The talks became a symbolic battleground, with both sides using them to influence public opinion rather than seeking genuine compromise. Back in Vietnam, soldiers on all sides continued to bear the brunt of the conflict. For many Americans, Tet marked a turning point in morale. Troops who had entered the war believing in victory now questioned their mission. Letters home revealed growing cynicism, frustration with shifting strategies, and fear that political decisions were costing lives needlessly. Some soldiers openly doubted the promises made by their commanders, reflecting the broader national sentiment that the war's purpose had become unclear. South Vietnamese forces, too, grappled with a complicated mix of pride and disillusionment. Many ARVN units had fought bravely during Tet, but their sacrifices often went unrecognized in American media, which tended to portray them as weak or unreliable. This lack of acknowledgement sapped morale and fueled resentment among South Vietnamese soldiers who felt they were fighting for their nation's survival but were overshadowed in global narratives. Meanwhile, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters faced their own ordeals. Survivors of Tet carried deep scars, physical, emotional, and spiritual. Many had lost comrades in horrifying numbers, yet their leadership framed the offensive as a victory of historic proportions. The communist strategy depended on portraying losses as noble and necessary, reinforcing the idea that perseverance would ultimately secure reunification. Villages in the north mourned sons who would never return, even as the government celebrated the achievements of the offensive. In time, the Tet Offensive came to symbolize more than a military campaign. It represented the collapse of illusions on all sides. For the Americans, it ended the belief that the war was nearing victory. For the South Vietnamese, it exposed vulnerabilities that would haunt the Republic for years to come. For the North, it proved that endurance and strategy could triumph over overwhelming force. And for the Vietnamese people, North and South, it marked one of the most devastating chapters in a long, painful struggle for control of their homeland.
In the months that followed the Tet Offensive, the landscape of the Vietnam War entered a phase of profound transition. Although combat operations continued with the same intensity that had defined previous years, the psychological and political terrain had shifted so dramatically that nothing about the conflict could ever return to its earlier form. American policymakers, military commanders, journalists, anti-war protesters, and ordinary citizens were now grappling with the consequences of an event that had exposed the fragility of their assumptions. Even those who argued that Tet was a military triumph recognized that the costs were irreversible. Confidence had been shaken, trust eroded, and the narrative of inevitable victory permanently dismantled. Within Vietnam itself, the after-effects continued to reverberate through every province and city. The South Vietnamese government embarked on massive reconstruction efforts, attempting to rebuild the devastated neighborhoods of Hue, Saigon, and dozens of provincial capitals. Yet the task was monumental and progress was slow. Rubble-strewn streets, collapsed homes, damaged temples, and makeshift refugee encampments were daily reminders of the traumatic upheaval. The economy, already strained by years of warfare, suffered further setbacks as thousands of displaced families struggled to survive.
Local markets reopened tentatively, their vendors haunted by memories of gunfire and explosions that had shattered what little sense of normality existed before Tet. Schools resumed classes, but many children faced empty desks where friends and siblings had once sat. The psychological wounds were visible on faces across the country, in the weary eyes of parents trying to comfort their families, in monks struggling to restore damaged pagodas, and in soldiers returning from brutal fighting only to find their homes destroyed. In many rural areas, American and ARVN forces moved aggressively to re-establish control, expanding programs intended to secure villages, provide humanitarian aid, and disrupt lingering Viet Cong influence. These pacification efforts, though well-intentioned in many cases, often encountered deep suspicion from civilians who had been traumatized by both sides during Tet. Some villagers blamed the communists for bringing war into their communities. Others blamed the Americans for the destruction that resulted from counterattacks. The complexity of local loyalties became even more entangled, and no amount of strategic planning could fully untangle the emotional devastation left in Tet's wake. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong, the backbone of the insurgency that had operated for years in the shadows of South Vietnam, found themselves decimated. Their ranks had been thinned drastically during Tet and the follow-up offensives that spring. Many of the most dedicated cadres, political officers, and local leaders were killed, leaving vacuums in villages and districts that had once been strongholds. This depletion of the Viet Cong dramatically altered the nature of the war. The North Vietnamese army filled the void, taking on greater responsibility for direct combat operations in the south. This shift signaled a strategic evolution. The conflict was transforming from an insurgency supported by local networks into a more conventional war led by a professional army capable of sustained large-scale engagements. American military analysts recognized this shift but disagreed sharply on what it meant. Some believed it indicated weakness in the communist movement, that the loss of the Viet Cong infrastructure made the enemy dependent on costly conventional warfare they could not sustain indefinitely. Others argued that it demonstrated adaptability and long-term strategic planning, eliminating the illusion that the war could be won through attrition. This strategic debate widened the divides within the U.S. government. As the presidential election season approached, candidates seized on the growing discontent. The Democratic Party fractured, with anti-war voices gaining prominence. Robert F. Kennedy emerged as a powerful advocate for de-escalation and negotiation, channeling the frustrations of millions of Americans who felt deceived by the government's optimistic assessments. His campaign inspired hope among those yearning for an end to the conflict, but his assassination in June of 1968 plunged the nation into deeper turmoil. His death, coming so soon after that of Martin Luther King Jr., amplified social unrest and raised profound questions about the direction of the country. On the Republican side, Richard Nixon positioned himself as the candidate of peace with honor, promising to end the war while maintaining American strength. His campaign capitalized on the division sown by Tet, presenting himself as the leader who could restore stability. After his election in November, Nixon inherited a conflict transformed by the offensive, militarily brutal, politically divisive, and increasingly unpopular. He and his advisors crafted a new strategy centered on Vietnamization, the gradual withdrawal of American troops while transferring responsibility to the South Vietnamese military. Yet the shadow of Tet loomed over every calculation. No matter how many troops the United States withdrew, no matter how many ARVN units were trained or equipped, the memory of how easily the communist forces had infiltrated and attacked the cities remained a constant reminder of South Vietnam's vulnerability. In North Vietnam, the leadership assessed Tet with a mixture of triumph and sober reflection. Publicly, it was celebrated as a historic victory, a decisive strike that had forced the Americans onto the defensive politically. Privately, however, the immense casualties weighed heavily. Entire units had been sacrificed during the offensive, and some senior commanders quietly questioned whether the price had been too high. Yet the political leadership remained steadfast in its conviction that Tet had shifted the balance of power. The American president had stepped aside, negotiations had begun, public opinion in the United States had turned sharply against the war, and the world now viewed the conflict through a new lens, one that favored the North's determination. The communist strategy relied on the belief that time, willpower, and political pressure mattered more than battlefield victories. Tet confirmed this belief. As the war dragged into the later years, the lessons of Tet became embedded in every tactical decision, every propaganda broadcast, and every diplomatic maneuver. For the communist movement, the offensive had validated the power of surprise, symbolism, and psychological warfare. It reinforced the conviction that the United States could be weakened not only by casualties on the battlefield, but by doubts in the hearts of its citizens. For the United States, Tet forced a reckoning with the limits of military power.
The offensive shattered the idea that technological superiority and massive firepower could guarantee victory in a conflict rooted in nationalism, ideology, and resilience. American soldiers continued to fight with courage and professionalism, but the political foundation of their mission began to crumble. The gap between battlefield reality and public perception widened into a chasm that no amount of official rhetoric could bridge. Over time, Tet became to symbolize the point at which American optimism gave way to uncertainty. For the South Vietnamese government, Tet exposed structural weaknesses that would haunt it until the final collapse in 1975. Despite moments of valor and determination, the Republic never fully recovered from the psychological and logistical shocks inflicted during the offensive. The South struggled to restore trust among its citizens, rebuild devastated communities, and counter the narrative that the communists had managed to strike at will. Even with substantial American support, the government faced internal divisions, corruption, and declining morale, problems exacerbated by the trauma of Tet. For the Vietnamese people, North and South, Tet was a tragedy etched into memory by fire and blood. Families mourned lost loved ones, rebuilt shattered homes, and carried the scars of violence in ways that transcended political ideology. Memories of the offensive passed from one generation to the next, shaping the cultural and emotional landscape long after the guns fell silent. As decades passed, historians came to view the Tet Offensive as one of the most consequential events of the 20th century, a turning point that reshaped global perceptions of American power, exposed the fragility of military assumptions, and demonstrated the complex interplay between battlefield events and political judgment. The offensive revealed that wars are not merely won or lost through territory, casualties, or firepower, but through the narratives that take shape in the minds of nations. Tet became a lesson in humility, a reminder that belief in victory is as essential as military capability, and that illusions can be as dangerous as any enemy strategy. It remains a symbol of how the unexpected can overturn the seemingly inevitable, how the weak can challenge the strong, and how the course of history can shift in a single night of fire and chaos. And in that sense, Tet endures not only as a battle fought in the streets of Saigon and the ruins of Hue, but as a moment that changed the way nations understand war itself.